Hello, everybody. It is Saturday night at 10 o'clock. I am Chris Weuve. This is Starfleet Tactical. And I have with me tonight, my good friend, Peter Gold. Peter is a merchant mariner. Peter is about to disappear for 6 months to go off and do that merchant mariner thing in an actual seagoing billet, as opposed to what he's been doing recently has been hanging around in Norfolk. There was a report that came out about the merchant marine, and so all of these things I just interpreted as a sign from somebody that it was time to have Peter on the show and talk about the merchant marine. So Peter, welcome.
Thank you.
Well. It's been interesting in the chat. We've been talking about bedtime and the fact that this is actually technically past my bedtime. I've been doing a show that's been technically past my bedtime the entire time. Pat Doyle actually ended up on the show because when Alec asked if I could do a Wednesday night show, I said, no, that's past my bedtime, but I know another guy who maybe could. And that's how Pat Doyle got pulled into what eventually turned into Starfleet Tactical. So bedtimes have been a driver of this show over the years. Tonight, like I said, we're going to talk about merchant mariners in space. The goal is not to talk about the merchant marine per se, and the goal is not to talk about logistics and the shipping industry and all that other stuff, although it's hard to talk about the people without talking about the ships. This one's really supposed to be about the ships, or about the people. I'm sorry, about the people. But, we'll wander away because we do that, right?
Yes.
So what have you been up to lately, Peter?
Technically unemployed. Got off my last ship 2-3 weeks ago. Had to go to school recently, and I'm heading off to school again tomorrow morning before I can take up a new job.
Okay, so let's split this up a little bit. Let's break this down. So first of all, when you say unemployed, correct me if I'm wrong. What you mean by that is you have an employer, but you are not currently under contract.
Pretty close. Yeah. As soon as before I left the last ship, they were lining me up to go on to another ship. So
Okay.
I had a job waiting for me. I had to do some training before they can allow me on there. I had to get some other paperwork done, a physical, things like that. If they didn't have something for me in a relatively short time, I would have called my maritime union and registered to see what they have for jobs any place. I know there's plenty of junior jobs available, but finding a senior job can be hit or miss sometimes.
Okay. Now you're going to see working for the same company though, right?
Yes, that will not be named.
Yes. Well, I was just about to ask you whether we can name the company or not. So let's just say that when I was reading through all the documents that I read through, their name came up. Yes. As a company that exists in these United States and actually hires people to go to sea on ships. So I think I've narrowed it down to the entire shipping industry, at least the U.S. portion of it. But you are technically unemployed and not, quote, on vacation. So
correct.
Tell us about being on vacation, because when you use that word, it means something different than when I use that word.
Okay, so if I am on a ship where I'm planned to go back to that ship in a certain period of time. So the last one, I had one where I'd worked roughly 4 months on, then 4 months off. That 4 months off was vacation.
Okay, but you're not getting paid during vacation, are you?
Correct. I'm not getting paid. I get a lump sum when I get off the ship that's considered vacation pay. I don't have to actually get it. I don't have to file for it and get it right when I get off. I can wait a while or I can build it up, which is useful at the beginning or end of the year. So when I get off the ship this time, depending upon how money is, I may not file. I may not file for vacation. And then I'll wait until after January and pick up the vacation check. And
And
tax
so
rate.
that moves it to the next tax year.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So, the more complicated your job gets, the more you have to understand tax codes. That seems to be a universal constant. So,
Yeah, if you don't want to pay a ton of taxes, that you're
yeah.
not otherwise legally obligated.
So,
So
I put together a few slides. Peter saw an earlier version of it. I should say to everybody, as a general rule, oftentimes I try to put everything on the slides, or at least I put the outline of whatever argument I'm going to make on the slides. In this particular case, it's more along the lines of a list of things that we should remember to talk about, more than it is. It's a list of topics more than it is an actual conveyance of information. So I'm going to go ahead and start those. The first one is just the standard announcement thing. So you'll note that I don't think the 20th of July was previously, I think that was previously green. That one changed because I'm going to be traveling. And in theory, I get back on Friday and should be available on Saturday, but that back on Friday is after like a 12-hour drive. That may get actually broken up into a 2-day drive. So I'm not quite sure yet. I think I'm going to decide that if I have a presentation ready when I leave to go to where I need to go, then I'll say yes. Otherwise, I may just decide to say no on that. And as you can see, even though I've decided I'm going to do a production calendar, I still don't know. I haven't filled in what I'm going to do 3 weeks out. Next week, I'm going to talk about amphibious and literal versus the science fiction equivalents thereof, which I would say are interface for amphibious. That's the word I came up with, and I spent a lot of time trying to think about it. And orbital for literal. And I'll sort of compare and contrast the various environments and some of the effects that they have. And then that'll be sort of a foundation to move into talking about Robert Work and what he had to say about the literal combat ship. And Chris Carlson plans on coming on board for that one. So that's what the current schedule looks like. Okay, so here's what the plan is for tonight. And as you can see, Peter, I think the big change is I expanded the history section a little bit and just added a few topics before and after. The United States is basically the slide that was in there before. And that's the one that you sort of put together the list of topics, and I'm just adding a little bit to that. And so let's talk about merchant marines and the merchant navy. And is the merchant navy a phrase that gets used with regard to the US, or was that a British thing?
it's a British thing.
Okay, it really sort of felt like a British thing, and they made it sound like it's the latest hot trend that the entire world is calling their merchant marine their merchant navy. But that really sort of felt to me like it was the Brits trying to claim everybody does it their way, which it's interesting because I read a lot of defense documents from other folks, and they all have their own individual flavor. And a recurring theme is like the US Navy will approach it in a particular way. And the Australians, they basically say the same kind of things, but they say it in an Australian accent. And the Canadians kind of say the same kind of things, and they say it in a Canadian accent. And the Brits seem to start with a clean sheet of paper, and they frequently get to the same conclusions that we do, but their terminology is all different.
Yeah. I've got a friend who's with a British he's a British merchant mariner. I won't say who he works for,
Okay.
but whenever I run things through him sometimes, especially for the fan club, of making sure that um, I try to internationalize stuff, so I'm
Hmm.
not just U.S. centric terminology. So like day lots, which is what's going on in Gaza right now, joint logistics over the shore, they have another term for it because they do the same thing.
Yeah. And
So
well, Peter made a reference to the fan club. He's talking about the Royal Manticore Navy, which is the Honor Harrington fan club. Well, is it Honor Harrington / David Weber fan club? So it's almost all Honor Harrington. But Peter is, it's organized in they borrowed the same idea from Starfleet, which is the Starfleet International, the Star Trek fan club, which is they organize as ships, and they have the different factions within the universe have their own navies with their own ships and stuff like that. And so like there's a bunch of guys who cosplay Army, and there's a bunch of guys who cosplay Grayson, and there's a bunch of people who cosplay Manticore. And Peter said, "Where's the Merchant Marine? Where's the Merchant Marine?" And
well,
so
actually, no,
Peter,
they already had that when I
oh, they
joined.
did?
That's why yeah, yeah, yeah. Remember, I
Oh,
was working.
okay.
I was working with you on talking merchant marine stuff from your building a
Well,
navy and such before I joined the fan club.
yeah. Well, we were talking about it, but I didn't think the fan club actually was doing anything with Merchant Marine stuff.
Well, they had it listed, and that's why I joined and found out that they weren't actually doing anything. They just had it as a
Yeah,
branch
yeah.
that hadn't been so.
It was
Um,
it was what we would call an important future direction. That's that's
yes,
that's what
yes.
when I worked for the software company, that's what we would tell people about bug report feature requests. It's an important future direction. So okay. So in any event, merchant navy is a British phrase. The fourth arm of defense, I believe, is one that came from Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he talked about now you sort of look at it and you go like he's talked about the Army, Air Corps. It gets listed as the Air Force, the Navy, and the Army, which of course that's wrong because there wasn't an Air Force back then. There was an Army Air Corps, and there was a department of the Navy, which includes the Marines, and then the Department of the Army. So it was it was a little bit of comparing apples and oranges, but the idea is that there was basically four legs to the stool, and the fourth leg was the merchant marine and its ability to ship stuff over to Europe and to wherever U.S. forces were engaged. So part of it was keeping our allies in the war and taking stuff over with Lend-Lease, et cetera. And part of it was just keeping us supplied. And especially in the early days of the war, there was a lot of direct support to the Navy. Like, the U.S. Navy bought a bunch of oilers and converted them to do underway replenishments and stuff like that.
Yeah,
So
those were Sal Michelliano has a YouTube uh, video specifically about the six oilers from the
yes.
Pacific.
Now,
Uh,
is it does he have that on his main channel or is it on another channel?
it's main channel.
Okay, so the channel here is what's going on with shipping. And we've referenced it before when we talked about the bridge, the MV Dolly hitting the bridge in Baltimore and stuff like that. Sal does fantastic work, absolutely fantastic work. He's a former merchant mariner turned professor of history, I believe, is what his degree is in, and he does basically merchant marine history and stuff like that. And back in the days when Ever Given, that was the name of the ship, right?
Yes,
That managed to get crosswise
sideways.
in the Suez Canal. Um, he, a bunch of his people who knew him said, hey, you should put something up on YouTube about this because you know what's going on. And he is another person who sort of stumbled into a YouTube channel. And so, and it's worth watching. He's a very sharp guy and he knows his stuff. So we talked about employed versus vacation versus unemployed. So let's talk a little bit about number of people on a ship. Like the ship that you were on, what is the one that we toured, right? What's its normal operating crew?
So that ship was built about 1970. It's a steamship, and relatively speaking, because it's a steamship, you still have to have a watch standard all the times down below. If you got a motor vessel or a gas turbine, at night you can go unmanned, nobody down below at all. But I believe the crew complement for normal activation is, I think, 35 or so.
Yeah,
That's a lot by modern standards.
yeah, and by Navy standards, that's like nothing.
Right, right. Yeah,
I mean,
we were in the yard, and I asked. There was a Navy ship next to us, and I asked one of the gate guards that at the pier, "How many people do you think we have on our ship?" And he was in the high triple digits, because
yeah,
we were almost as long as they were, and they were a Gator freighter.
yeah. And when you could bring more people on board if you were actually in the repairing helicopters and stuff like that, and you brought the Marines on board to do all that stuff, but they're not actually running the ship. They're passengers as far as you guys are concerned, right? Um,
Yes.
but like I've been on the bridge of a destroyer coming into port, and we had 15 or 20 people on the bridge coming into port. Now some of them were like I wasn't standing a watch. I was just enjoying the view and thought it was cool. And there was a few people that were up there because they were writers and they were just along for the ride. But in terms of like watch standards, you had two lookouts, an officer of the deck, a junior officer of the deck, a conning officer, bright bridge, helm, and lee helm. And two, did I say two lookouts? There was at least two lookouts.
Yes.
Um, and because they were coming in port, I think the CO was on the bridge too. And the XO might have been on the bridge. I can't remember where the XO was. So it was pretty darn full. Um, and so I've been on other spaces on an aircraft carrier where we had 25 people in a relatively small room, or of whom about half were working the problem, and a few of us were collecting data, and a bunch of other people were just sort of like hanging out, seeing if their piece of gear was working or not. So, so
Yeah.
merchant ships have,
Merchant ship underway, so you're not coming into port. Um, Figure 3 people.
yeah, I can believe it.
Yeah. I actually the very first ship I got on after I got my license, I went up to the bridge in the evening. Um, we were far enough north that it was still late evening and sun hadn't set, and we were running an AB and a mate on watch, and the AB was out doing stuff. So it was a 22-year-old person in charge of the ship. Um, she was the only one up there.
Well, both the Navy and the Merchant Marine give a lot of responsibility to really young people.
Yeah, well, the Navy seems to also have an awful lot of people there with them, so that makes a big
Yeah.
difference. But autopilot was on, and all she had to do was she was the lookout and had to do the plotting. But this is before they tightened up the rules on lookouts, so now she'd have to have another, basically a full-time lookout.
Okay, I can see that.
Yeah, yeah. So
Okay, so let's talk about flags, um, U.S. flag versus foreign flag, and how many ships are actually in the Merchant Marine? I think the answer right now is like 190, right?
about 180 U.S. flag ocean-going ships. Okay,
So U.S. flagged is different from U.S. owned.
correct, correct.
So I'm sure there's a bunch of U.S. owned that are registered in Liberia,
Marshall
Panama,
Isle, yeah.
and
Oh
the
yeah.
other usual suspects.
Yep. Yep. If you
Um,
can figure out who actually owns it, figuring out who owns what and is doing what can be a little confusing at times.
yeah,
Um,
you can have like a US company owning a Panamanian registered ship with Eastern European officers and Filipino crew, unlicensed crew, carrying a cargo that is currently owned by, I don't know, China or somebody, but could be sold in transit. That's one of the things I did at one point in my life back when I was at the Naval War College. I did a little bit of research on petroleum shipping, and it wasn't unusual for the entire contents of a super tanker to be sold 2 or 3 times on the journey. So the
yep.
question of whose cargo is that is actually way harder than it sounds.
Yeah. 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 So the other thing you'll hear is flag state and port state.
Okay.
Okay, so flag state is the country where the ship is registered, under what flag it flies.
Mm-hmm.
Port state is the physical waters that a ship is in. So a Panamanian ship, Panamanian flag, Panamanian registered ship pulls into Japan, the Japanese Coast Guard will come on board and inspect it for port state control. And
Okay.
they have to, and now they're not enforcing Panamanian shipping regulations, and they're not enforcing Japanese regulations. They're enforcing the bare bones minimum international regulations.
And
So,
looking for knives, if I remember correctly.
well, that'd be customs people for Japan.
Oh,
Yes,
okay. Okay.
yes,
The
yeah,
Japanese have a thing about knives,
yes,
which is funny considering that they're, you know, swords and shit.
yeah,
But they got a thing about knives. I remember being told, like, don't try to take a knife into Japan. Just anything that's got anything that even remotely looks like a blade, just leave it behind. It'll be easier. So
I'm going to point out that's probably why they have a thing for knives, because they have a history of swords, and stabby things are probably, problematic for that reason.
I think, if I remember correctly, there was a particular incident that occurred where somebody.
I think you're right. I think it was actually Yakuza related, is why, actually, just
No,
historically speaking.
I want to say there was
Um,
something involving a school that they had an incident, like there was a.
Google is our friend. I will
Yeah.
be behind the scenes Googling.
yeah.
Okay, so let me go on to the next slide. Um, so now I say, where do merchant mariners come from? But I'm specifically talking about officers here, licensed versus unlicensed. So Peter, licensed versus unlicensed, is that the same as officer versus enlisted?
Pretty much. Conceptually, it is. There's entry rating, which means you have never been on a ship before, you haven't taken any Coast Guard exams, and you're going to learn everything on the job. You have unlicensed that actually have a qualification of some sort, whether it's able seaman, um, electrician, refrigeration engineer, things of that nature, QMed, and they will have taken at least one exam from the U.S. Coast Guard if they're Americans, to show they're qualified at some level. Officers, the number of exams you take is partially dependent upon rank. Basically, you have to test up.
I found
So,
the answer. In
Yeah.
2008, there was something called the Akihabara massacre, where a guy, essentially, he took a rented truck and ran into people with it, and then stabbed at least 12 people with a dagger and killed 4 others and injured 8.
Yeah.
So that is the actual reasoning behind the knife laws in Japan.
So, okay,
Yeah.
so we've got one of the schools is the United States Merchant Marine Academy at Kings Point, New York, if I remember correctly, right?
It's
And
the old Chrysler estate.
and it is the equivalent of a service academy. It's you apply to get in, and if you get in, the federal government pays for your schooling and in return for a commitment to a certain number of years of service. And that leads to, there's some different qualifications that you can get. You end up being what's known as a strategic sea lift officer, which means in theory you can speak both Navy and merchant at the same time.
Yes.
And frequently these people are like naval reservists, and because they're on the SSO list, they can in theory be pulled out of a job and then plopped into another job in time of national emergency. But in practice, they're if they are going to sea, if they sometimes they're ashore and haven't maintained all their skill levels, in which case you probably wouldn't want to do that with them. Or alternatively, they're going to sea, which means they're probably in a job that they have to continue doing in the event of a national emergency. And so there's a lot of people who sort of wonder whether you're ever actually going to get anything out of these guys anyway, because they're either not going to be the guy that you want, or they're too important to move into that billet.
And the commitment you get coming out of Kings Point is a commitment to be a Navy officer, a SSO, Strategic Sea Lift Officer.
So,
and part of that is you have to sail for 5 years on your license.
So and in theory, in time of warfare, they can plop you as a liaison to the merchant marine.
Right.
So
right, which is, I find questionable. If we don't have enough people to begin with, where do we want them? You know, if they've maintained their license, well, we're going to put them on a ship,
yeah,
one way or the other.
And we're real short. I mean, this all started off because there was something that's in a list of references at the end. There was a report that came out that talked about how short we are, and there's a lot of very interesting things here. I would recommend that everybody go and find this. If you're even remotely interested about this, find the Seth Cropsey report that's at the tail end of this, and also go to CIMSEC, CIMSEC, the Center for International Maritime Security, I think is what CIMSEC stands for, and look for Strategic Sea Lift Week. Do a search for that, and they had an entire list of topics on sea lift sort of stuff, and there's some really, really fascinating things in there. Including some places where people are very forward-leaning about how to get around problems, etc. There's a lot of those things that you can just sort of take it, file the serial numbers off, put in space on the end, and you can actually, it would work really well in an in-space sort of situation.
Yeah.
Thank you for putting that up. There's an interesting phrase that comes up, and that's hawse pipe. So let's talk about hawse pipes for a second.
A hawse piper is somebody who started off unlicensed and went to something other than a maritime academy. So there are other private or union training schools, and sometimes the training is usually it's all Coast Guard approved. And sometimes they come out really, really good. Sometimes they're average, or sometimes not so. But they get the sea time in a various positions, get a license, start sailing on their license. What they don't get is any kind of a college degree, which means they can't go into the SSO program. So it's an issue that we're probably going to be covering later in the episode.
So let's go ahead and move on. Okay, let's
Yep.
talk a little bit about a few old stuff things. Um, there have been sailors going back for a long, long time.
Yeah.
Back there was you go back to the Bronze Age, and there's a surprisingly robust international trade that between a lot of different countries. They took finished goods, they took raw materials like cedar from Lebanon, they took foodstuffs, both luxury and staples. There's a lot of stuff that moved around, and the rule of thumb that I heard was that it was harder to move something 20 miles by land than it was to move it across the Mediterranean by ship.
Wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, and especially if you're talking about some place like Greece where it's all changes in elevation, right? It's all valleys, it's all mountainous. You're doing lots of up and down, etc. And so good to be a port in like Athens had a big advantage because they were right on the water. You look at the Greek cities, a lot of them are right on the water. There's some exceptions like Sparta, but a lot of them are right on the water. And
you saw that you'll see that in the US too, in the colonial period.
Yes, very much so. Very much so. During the age of galleys, I put that up there versus the age of sail because I think in a lot of ways, the big difference between the two is in the age of galleys, you basically, as a general rule, okay, exceptions to all rules, etc., but as a general rule, you stayed close to shore and you probably went ashore at night. You probably beached the ship at night. They were relatively low draft, so you'd beach it at night. You'd sort of camp out, and then you'd get back on the ship and go to continue sailing the next day. During the age of sail, though, Admiral Nelson, there was a time period where he didn't go ashore for like 2 years during the blockade of France. And so age of sail, you had some very long journeys. People were on board ships for weeks, if not months at a time. And that was also, it was sort of interesting how things played out. During the age of galleys, you had some ships, warships were basically under oar. They might use sails for strategic movement, but for tactical movement, they were under oar. During the age of sail, you're under sail pretty much all the time. But a lot of the ships at that time period were really, a warship was a merchant ship that took some cannons out of storage and mounted them, right? When you went to war, you converted your regular ships into merchant ships. Your merchant ships into warships. That really sort of ended around late 1600s, mid to late 1600s, if I remember correctly. When you started seeing more specialized warship, the real exception to that was the British East India Company and some of the other ones where you had armed merchantmen that were sort of these weird hybrids. And they, compared to what the locals had, they were pretty heavily gunned. And they could hold a frigate off, but you wouldn't want to fight a real warship with them.
Right.
And I specifically mentioned the Anglo-Dutch Wars here because the Anglo-Dutch Wars are interesting in that it's two maritime empires fighting each other, two serious, hardcore maritime empires fighting each other. And during a time period where you still had lots of generals going to sea, and generals commanding, which leads us into the phrase master and commander, which today is mostly an archaic phrase, but at a time had a particular meaning. And so, Peter, tell us about master and commander.
Okay, so for a long time, you'd have basically an army guy in charge of the ship for combat stuff. In part because there wasn't a lot of combat you could do other than come alongside and ram or board. So they came up with, so you had a sailing master. So that was the master part.
No,
And
that was the
him and
commander part, right? The master is the guy who handles the ship. The commander is the guy who handles the troops.
right, yeah. So you had the sailing master,
Yeah.
and then and you'll see this mostly came out. I think it came out of the Royal Navy. Master and commander meant that the office that both the guy on the captain was a qualified navigation officer. You'll see that with Russell Crowe in the movie Master and Commander,
Mm-hmm.
that he not only is in charge of all the warfare stuff, but he also is in charge of navigation. Now he's got that sailing master that helps him, but you see him teaching the midshipmen how to do celestial nav. And you couldn't become a lieutenant in the Royal Navy in the 1700s onward unless you could navigate.
Yeah, and you see an echo of that in Honor Harrington, in that there was a one of the characters in one of the early novels was left over from the days when you had sailing masters that handled the Warshawski sails, and I thought that was a little contrived that they had.
I think that's why he never brought it out again.
Yeah, there was a few things that David did, especially the early days, that were a little contrived. I'm glad that he originally had this idea that when the grazers would fire, they would flush, I want to say, sodium down the barrels to cool them. And so he was originally going to have actual like gun smoke be a factor, and he got away from that fairly early on, which is a good thing. I think that would have been kept taking the metaphor a little bit too far. So
yes.
So like I said, this is usually not the way it's done, although you can end up with some weird things. I know that in the USNS John Canley has a civilian merchant crew with a civilian captain who is the ship's master, and then it's got a separate commander who was a Navy captain who was on board to do all the mission related stuff. And for the Navy crew, they have a blue crew and a gold crew. I don't know what they do for the merchant crew, and that's the only modern example that I can think of a master and commander sort of situation in the modern era, like today.
USNS Blue Ridge or USS Blue Ridge.
Oh, it does the same thing. Okay.
Yes.
Interesting. I didn't know about that. I haven't been on any of the command ships, and I feel like I've missed something. I feel like I've been cheated. So
yeah, they're unique, mostly because if you put a merchant crew on to do deck, the regular deck department stuff, the regular engineering, running of the engine room, and steward's department, you need a lot less people.
yeah.
They're just expected to work and get paid more. So they don't throw bodies at it. So
the Navy's really good at throwing bodies at it, because for a long part of its existence, it had an unlimited supply of bodies.
Yep.
Okay, so here's some interesting things about specifically with regard to the United States. So pull out which ones you think are important.
Okay, U.S. is a maritime power by virtue of geography.
Yep.
We used to have a coastal trade, a very robust one. That got decimated. Contrary to Peter Zeihan, it got decimated by the interstate highway system, and a little bit less by barges and a lot by pipelines.
Yeah.
So when we started moving all our petroleum and natural gas, well, mostly petroleum, by pipeline, all the tankers that used to run from Houston or from Texas up to New England, they basically were able to go away. So
Yeah, pipelines are fantastic in that regard.
yeah, I mean, if you're trying to move a liquid or a gas, you go by pipeline. After that, you go by water. The next one down is rail. And the last thing you want to do is move it by truck.
Yeah, yeah.
So we actually had a problem when they did a cyber attack on there was a pipeline that goes along the southeast coast, Frontier, I think. But we just didn't have the tankers available
Yeah,
in time to do anything. Even if they had issued a waiver, you've got that problem of, okay, you put the oil on a tanker and you've given a waiver to go up to New England from or gasoline, give it a waiver from Mississippi to go up to Virginia, and all of a sudden somebody says, well, we'll pay you more for that cargo. And that cargo that was supposed to go up to Virginia to keep the American cars running, all of a sudden is going to Europe.
yeah.
So, if it was a U.S. flag tanker, the U.S. government can say, yeah, no, you are only going to. So,
Well, and that actually gets into the Jones Act,
yes,
which says that that shipments between two U.S. ports have to go on U.S. flagged vessels.
specifically, it's if you load a cargo in one U.S. port, you must go hit a foreign port before you can unload it in a second U.S. port.
If you are not U.S. flagged.
If you're not U.S. flagged. Yes. So if you're a foreign flag ship, you can offload cars in Boston, load something else in Boston, go down and just go down to New York, offload some of your foreign originated cargo, pick up more American, and work your way down the coast. You just can't move stuff between two U.S. ports. You can't pick up cargo in Boston and then move it to New York.
Yeah.
So
there's some similar things in the airline industry too.
Yeah, and you've got that also for passenger liners. It's the Passenger Service Act, I believe. I can't remember what year that is, but that's why.
And this is why, like Princess Cruise Lines takes people down to Mexico. It's not just because they like Puerto Vallarta.
Yeah.
So, let's see. Anything else we want to talk about on this slide?
U.S. Maritime Service.
Okay.
So, U.S. Maritime Service was created in the late 30s, and very much more a training organization during World War II. And they sort of let it lapse. Technically, it still exists. There's some stuff they'd have to bring back, ranks and such for people with a license. They've talked about it because it would make life a little bit easier for ships that are being activated right now. If you're on a government-owned contract-operated ship and you need a common access card, a CAC, you might not be able to get one in time easily.
Yeah.
So that limits your access to doing things on the ship in terms of IT stuff.
It's all about the paperwork.
Yeah. So it's like, yeah, I can't get into the computer to do the IMO required or safety management system required lockout tagout form. Okay, so yeah, I can operate the engines and I know what's going on, but I can't access anything on the computer that tells me what maintenance needs to be done. I can't write up anything. So For junior officers, it's a major inconvenience. For senior officers, yeah, you can't do half your job. So
I can believe that.
yes,
I say this as a guy who accidentally locked his CAC last week and had to I spent 5 hours jumping through hoops to find a place where I could get my CAC turned back on, which was
yeah,
harder than it should be for reasons I won't go into.
yeah, yeah,
Fourth time was a charm. Let's put it that way.
yes.
Okay, so let's see. I'm going to go ahead and move on to specifically the post-war era. So a couple of themes that we see in the post-war era: increasing speed of transit, increasing volume of trade, increasing predictability, and that you can, because of the speed of transit, but a large chunk of that increasing predictability is because you know exactly how long it's going to take to unload the ship and load it back up again, and it's going to get back in. If you read the box, one of the things is, a ship would come into port, and you don't know how long the ship's going to be in port, because it could take a week, it could take 2 for the stevedores to actually unload the ship. It took forever to unload ships and load them back up again. And now that stuff happens very fast. And because of the decreasing unloading times, it means that merchant mariners, no longer have the opportunity to have a girl in every port, because they just aren't there long enough. In fact, I think a lot of times, like, I've heard it said, like, did you get off the ship? And the answer is, I went out and stood on the pier, but I didn't actually get off the pier.
Yes, that's happened to me a couple of times. We spent 7 days in Germany. I walked to the bow. I got onto the pier, walked to the bow, and took the draft readings, and that was it.
Oh, but you were there for 7 days, though.
Yeah, yeah. I took on 1.5 million gallons of fuel through a 3-inch hose. If I wasn't on watch or I wasn't taking on fuel, I was sleeping. Yeah, that was a 100-hour week.
Wow.
Yeah. So,
So
there's I'm trying to, I can't find it right now. I'd have to look it up, but it's in the box. They did a study. They counted the line items of boxes, or of line items of cargo on I think it was a Mariner, but it was a break bulk cargo ship in the 50s, going from United States to Europe. 112,000 line items.
Yeah, I can believe that.
Right. Every single one of which had to be checked off by hand, verified, moved by hand, moved into a warehouse, sorted as to where it was going. You may have to, if you messed up a little bit or too much, you may have to take off cargo, put it in the warehouse for a day or two, and then repack it, because it was on top of something else that needed to come off earlier.
Yeah, and that was part of the thinking when we designed the rotary container ship, was that you wouldn't have to do stuff like that, because you just move when you're going from one star system to another, you'd defrag your freighter, is how I phrased it, and move everything around, so that when you got there, everything that was offloading would be right there, ready to pop right out. Boom, 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 boom. You take the new stuff on, etc. So if you're sitting there in the audience going, rotary container ship, what on earth is Chris talking about? Do a search. You'll find it. There was an episode. Peter and I designed a container ship spacecraft, originally designed for use in the Honorverse. David has his own ideas about how spacecraft in the Honorverse work, how container ships in the Honorverse work. So it's not an official canon ship at all. We couldn't convince him that this was the right answer. And so we've got our own container ship design, complete with CAD/CAM drawings and the like. And at some point we want to do more with it, but we're not there yet. So
Cedar Sanderson, she's an independent author. She's planning on using it. one of her books or book series.
Is she writing that series now?
I don't know. I haven't talked to her for a while. I'd have to reach out to her.
Yeah, I need to. I've been meaning to reach out to her and sort of say like, hey, if I can help, I'm happy to do it. So I still need to do that.
Yeah.
One of these
So
days.
she knows to reach out to either one of us for stuff.
Yeah, happy to help.
Yeah, I've had a couple of authors reach out. So,
and I've done a little bit more thinking about it since then. But all this stuff fits into, like, if you want to write science fiction in a background like this, you kind of have to figure out how this stuff works. And so, like, does it work like the Age of Sail? Does it work like pre-war steam? Does it work like post-war container ships? In David's universe, it really kind of works like post-war container ships. So you have huge volumes of trade. I frequently see stuff in science fiction where, like, the description, they talk about the importance of interworld trade, but then the scenario they sort of present really sort of looks like Venice, and and it's like the spice trade. People are concerned with very small amounts of cargo, tiny amounts of cargo, and it's like, how can you make any what clearly trade isn't important if you're talking about such small amounts of cargo.
yeah.
So, and I think actually, oh yeah, real world issues, and then we'll talk about science fiction. So we already talked about how there's not very many U.S. flag vessels anymore. So if you want to call them up in the event of an emergency, there just isn't very many of them. There's not very many merchant mariners, U.S. merchant mariners, to go along with them. So we're not very deep. The number of vessels that are participating in the programs that allowed them to be called upon are not very deep. And all the ships in those programs, like all those ships we have in reserve, and a lot of the ships in the program are kind of old.
Yeah. I have a graphic that Sal Mercuriano made. He posted up on Twitter. There's a lot of 58, 57, 43, 47, 55-year-old ships in the MARAD Ready Reserve Fleet.
Mm-hmm.
So they're getting up there. So, and they're failing. It's harder and harder to get parts for them. So you have to re-engineer what you're doing. More stuff breaks. So, and sometimes, especially with the older ships, a lot of them are steam, and we just don't have enough people that know how to operate steam very well because they don't get a chance to play with it.
In order for you to be qualified to operate steam, you have to be an old person, right, Peter?
There's some training that they get at the academies, but if you really want to be good at it, you have to have either worked on the Great Lakes, where they still have a number of active steamships,
Oh, really?
or be an old person. Yes.
So the reason why I said that is I know for a fact that Peter is qualified for steam. He's worked on steamships. He was very, very, it was very cool watching him interact with the people at the Battleship Wisconsin, because, as he explained, he had studied the steam plant. He had a class where they studied the steam plant on the Iowa class ship. So that was pretty cool.
Yeah.
So I didn't realize that there was a lot of steamships on the Great Lakes. Why is that?
Because the ships don't wear out as fast. They don't. It's not salt water, so they don't corrode as much.
Okay, I can see that. That makes sense to me. So if you, for what it's worth, everybody, if you look at ships like Great Lakes ships, and they look like, you just sort of look at them and you go, oh yeah, that's like an ocean going ship, and it's like, no, it's not. No, it's not. There are actually a lot of engineering differences there, and I'm just at the point where I can start seeing some of those engineering differences. Like the length to beam ratio is frequently kind of weird for an ocean going ship, and it has to do with the size of the locks that they have to go through, things like that.
Yeah, it's the locks in the river that you have to worry about.
So I'm going to throw up that comment again that Logix Finance put out, and that most sci-fi writers aren't knowledgeable about logistics or practical matters, so they gloss over them. That's actually, in a lot of ways, that's my purpose in life, right? That's my avocation.
I was going to say, I feel like that's partially the entire point of this show.
Oh, I disagree. It's not partially the entire point of the show. It's totally the entire point of this show.
Like, where the entire point of Starfleet Tactical is to point out things like this.
Yeah.
Because a good portion of the time, yeah, you're right. They don't take into account these logistics that, had they consulted someone about, they probably would actually include in their media. Whether that's television or, literature, doesn't matter. It's one of those things that when you have someone to consult on something that you're not knowledgeable about, you're going to have a better product.
I frequently say that my fandom superpowers, I can talk about real world navies and science fiction navies at the same time. And I also frequently, like when I'm doing my what the US Navy taught me about Starfleet Talk in particular, I will talk about how every time I went to sea, I had 2 notebooks. One that I used to collect the data for whatever project I was working on that sent me to sea, and another one that was just notes about what it was like being at sea. And that was explicitly so that I could share it with friends of mine that were interested in that stuff, a lot of whom were science fiction writers. I remember Sherwood Smith saying to me, I was telling her after my first time at sea and about all the different stuff. And she said, I wish I could just listen to them talk for an hour. And so I tried to capture pieces of conversation and stuff. And I also captured things like, what color is the floor? Because the color of the floor on a Navy ship,
that matters.
The floor changes based upon what kind of space you're in.
Yeah, no, because that's like security would be a different color than like medical, for example.
Well, it was mostly like combat spaces. Workspaces were a different space than living spaces were a different space, a different color than hallways.
Well, and logistically speaking, that makes sense, because if you're in a combat situation, if you are like your body is buzzing with adrenaline, you're going to need visual cues in order to know where the hell you even are.
Yep. And if you're in CIC, the walls are painted black. If you're in a because they're trying to keep the light level, it's about controlling the light level. Whereas if you're in a living space, the walls are painted white, sort of an off-white, because you're trying to reflect as much light as you can.
You're trying to make it feel more open versus
and the other thing
the situation in regards to like, hey, we need to be able to see the thing that we're currently working around, and in order to do so, we have to control the lighting.
And when
it's the same reason, like with filming, for example, I've got a light here and a light here, but I have like my window covered.
When the lights go out on a ship, there are no windows. When the lights go out in a ship, it's dark. And that's why everybody carries a flashlight. I mean, everybody carries a flashlight. I carried 3.
Fair.
I had a flashlight in my pocket. I had a little LED light that was on my did I carry 3 or did I carry 2? Maybe I only carried 2. I think I eventually got to the point where I carried 2, because my car keys weren't in my pocket, and my key to my lock for my padlock was around my neck on a chain around my neck, and I had a little light around my neck. And so, and they're red. They were red lights because if you shine a white light in a berthing area at night when people are trying to sleep, it will shine right through your eyelids, and you will really
wake everyone up.
off. So I might have at one point I experimented with carrying a white light and a red light, but I eventually just went to carrying the red light. So
makes sense.
And I carried a Leatherman tool.
Yeah.
because everybody carried a Leatherman too.
So number of U.S. merchant mariners and then the differences with the armed
Okay.
services. So we are 1,000 people short of manning the actual ships, roughly. I
Hmm.
think it is. I got my numbers here someplace. No, sorry, we have 100 extra people at the moment to man up every single ship that we have.
Yeah, and at least one source I saw said that they didn't believe the numbers because they thought that there was an awful lot of double counting, because they thought that because people can be civilian mariners, contract mariners, or SSOs. Well, you could be theoretically all three of those, and at the same time, and so they weren't confident that that somebody who was in more than one category was only being counted once.
The other part is that's not giving any leeway for anybody being sick.
Yeah.
So if somebody was home and they broke a leg and can't go to sea because they're in a cast for another couple of months. Yeah, there's only 100 people to cover those missing people. So if anybody's out for any reason whatsoever, they're overseas at the wrong time and they're having trouble getting back. So that's
I'm going to throw something Logic's finest, a little sidebar, something here. Something that bothers me about sci-fi: a hit anywhere in the ship would not be translated as damage in the CIC or bridge. Depends. It depends on a couple of things. Because first of all, shock damage can show up in weird places. So you could end up with something there. The part that I think is actually kind of foolish is is in Star Trek when you have these carbonized rocks falling from the ceiling. There's always debris that seems to be falling from the ceiling, and I don't understand where that's coming from.
That's coming from production value.
And things that explode with a shower of sparks. But that having been said, shock damage can go to a lot of different places. Shock damage can go to a lot of different places. Incidentally,
well, the reason I said that is because, very specifically, if you're having your computer systems get affected in CIC or bridge in sci-fi, that very likely means you have a fire between you and somewhere else.
Yeah.
And you have bigger problems at that point.
So I will note that shock damage can also affect people in weird ways. I say that as somebody who once fell on a sidewalk, slammed his palm into the pavement, and broke a rib as a result.
That, and also my mom at one point, how she broke her one of her bones in her arm up here. I don't remember which one. But she landed on it and she twisted her wrist and it snapped it in 2 or 3 places.
Ooh, ow.
all right. So so we're short numbers.
Okay.
That report we've been mentioning, they're calling, they want 5,000 more officers for the Merchant Marine. And they've also have a big push there about getting that these officers should be also strategic sea lift officers.
And it's interesting, if you just dumped another 5,000 officers into the system, what does that do for everybody's pay?
The other thing is, of course, if you dump 5,000 SSOs into the US Navy Reserve System, that's 12% of the officers in the total reserves.
Yeah.
And that's counting JAG, medical, etc. So here's 5,000 more. Yes, they're SSOs, but they're also effective. They're unrestricted line. So yeah. Now the reason some of this matters is that um, with the armed forces, if they don't have, they will find a job for you temporarily.
Yeah.
You may be sitting someplace in transit, because they don't really have a billet for you at the moment, but they're still paying you.
They, yeah, I think that the lesson I took away from all this was that we can't fix the system just by throwing people at it, right? Or just buying more ships, right? We have to sort of rethink some of the fundamentals in order to, because if all you did was add people to the system, you'd change the balance in such a way that it would have some good effects, but it also have some bad effects. So I think it's more complicated than that.
Yeah. The other part, going back to the unemployed vacation working, if people can't find a job for a while, they go find a job someplace else, and if they stay long enough, they don't go to sea anymore.
Yeah.
So back in the late 80s, I was off on vacation, ran into a guy. He was working as a security guard, studying for his second steam. He was in a different union, and they didn't have anywhere near the number of jobs that my union did. So he'd been off for a while. Another friend of mine, he worked 3 months, made a lot of money, couldn't find another job for 18 months. He went into computers instead.
I can understand that.
Because yeah, it's really nice that you're making a lot of money. And then all of a sudden, yeah, no, I can't find a job, so you go find something else.
Yeah.
Unlike the military, where no, we don't have a ship for you. You're going to go sit in an office someplace. I don't think the Navy actually has a problem with lack of people, but they manage their manpower a lot closer in some ways.
Yeah, they're short in a lot of places, but yeah,
Yeah,
but they're probably better off. Okay,
yeah.
so let's
I
talk about.
mean,
Oh, go
yeah,
ahead.
yeah. I mean, if they had too many people coming in or staying for a year or two, they end up decommissioning some ships. They're not going to kick these people out of the service easily. Not to reduce the number for 1 year and then have to get them back a year later.
Yeah.
They'll put them on staff someplace. So, all right.
All right, let's talk about science fiction.
Yep.
Okay, so these are all situations where we see something that looks like merchant mariners, but they're all different in some important ways. Um, so the Solar Clipper series is a series that is about merchant mariners as envisioned by Nathan Lowell. And it's really, really, really seriously good. And it's a pretty straightforward translation of the current system, right?
Yes. Yes. Both the only differences are transit times
Mm-hmm.
and the fact that they have a pretty much an agreement that they always spend at least 4 days in port on each end of the trip.
Yeah, it's a
You
fantastic series. I really recommend it. Um, and he does such a great job with it. I jokingly say that it's a series that nothing happens during it, but it's still utterly fascinating reading. And that one point they thought about something happening, and then they thought better of it. Um, but it's really, really really fantastic, and is really a good understanding of sort of how it approaches. And the main character starts off as an unlicensed guy who needed a job like right away, and started at the very bottom of the ladder and worked his way up and got an appointment to the academy, and eventually ends up owning his own ship and stuff like that. So it's really good. The Vados War series is sort of interesting in that the main character works for a great shipping company, a family-owned shipping company, but you see her do things like go to the I don't remember if they called it the guild hall or not, but it's something like that when she's hiring crew and stuff like that. And so so you see sort of it's a very interesting take in that, you know, she's one of the owners, but her family's undergoing there's some drama involving the family so you get to see, so she's not like on a big ship, she's a very small fry, she's just you know, right out of school. This is her first command when the shit hits the fan, and it's a very interesting series. In Honor Harrington, which I think I misspelled there, in the Honor Harrington series, you see big ships and a few things that sort of peripherally involve ships, but nothing that really is focused on them. The shipping characters just sort of come through briefly and then they move on. You look like you were going to say something, Peter. If you're muted if you're talking.
All right. Yeah. For some reason, my headphone decided to stop working briefly.
Ah, okay.
And then when it came back in, it auto muted. Don't know why.
It's a thing that I'm sure the system or your headphones itself does.
Yeah.
Just so like it doesn't come back in.
Yeah. So in Honor Harrington series, David mostly talks about the strategic importance of the merchant marine and trade. You know, there's from a roughly Rising Thunder onward, you start seeing, well, especially where Honor Harrington is no longer going on these death rides. And he's starting to build into more strategy, politics, geopolitics. You know, we're just going to pull our ships out of your trade area, and all of a sudden, we're not moving any cargo because the Solarian League doesn't have any ships. So
yeah, he is on record as saying that interstellar transportation on a per mile basis is the cheapest form of transportation in the history of the human race. Now, my response to that is I think per mile is a poor metric in this situation, that per time is probably a better metric, in that there's still some huge capital costs. But that's neither here nor there. There's not a whole lot about the merchant marine in there, although he does have an idea of how it works in the background. Star Trek has a little bit of this. You see some in Star Trek Enterprise where you actually meet merchant families that own freighters and stuff. And it's kind of interesting because they're out interfacing with the rest of the universe. And it was sort of surprising to me because Starfleet is talking about, we're going to go out and explore the universe. And they get out there and there's already human traders that are out there already doing their thing. And it's sort of like, okay, got it. It's not really, you know, boldly going where no man has gone before. You're kind of going where a bunch of people have gone before. But, you know, it is what it is. But we don't see a whole lot in Star Trek. And other than that, I mean, you occasionally see onesies and twosies, but you never really get any impression about what the system looks like in Star Trek. And when you start
there's
thinking about replicators and stuff like that, it sort of begs the question of what exactly does trade look like in the Star Trek universe?
this dives into the whole Star Trek economic stuff. You
Yeah,
know,
which is an interesting topic. I won't say that way madness lies, although that may be true, but it's still an interesting topic.
yeah,
The Liaden series by Steve Miller and Sharon Lee. I love the Liaden series, but the trade in it doesn't quite make sense to me. You've got these family owned trading empires, and they seem to be moving small amounts of cargo, and I never quite understand how it works. I mean, the model seems to be sort of a Venetian model, but I need to go back and reread stuff. It's been a while. This is a series that every time once every 10 years, I go and reread everything and get caught up to wherever they are at that point. And so I need to probably go and do that again. So,
Alliance Union. It's the family lives on the starship, and they just max out the life support capacity for a
yeah,
while.
yeah. And it's interesting because a lot of the old merchant ships started off as sublight freighters. They put families on board because they knew that the journeys were going to take years, and the families in effect ended up stealing the ships and sort of building their own so now there's independent trade families that might have as many as 3 ships, but they go off and they do their thing. And I I don't understand how the economics of that works. I'm trying to comprehend what is it that you're shipping that it can take years to get to a place, and it's worth actually trying to do shipping that way.
Yeah, I mean the very initial startup was exploration and just settling colonization. But trade was didn't necessarily make a lot of sense to have
Yeah.
trade.
Now we saw the same thing in the movie Avatar, but in their case they had the miracle drug that extended human lifespans, and that was about the only thing that you could get, or unobtainium. No, it was what was it?
Unobtainium ore.
Unobtainium ore. I'm getting my backgrounds mixed up. Unobtainium ore, which was so incredibly valuable that it actually made it worthwhile. I mean, Elon Musk famously said that if the moon was made out of cocaine, it wouldn't be economically viable to go to the moon to get the cocaine. Um, um, so uh, Greg Kostikian wrote a article called "The $9 billion Bottle of Wine," where he sort of
Yes.
back of the envelope some of the economics of some of this stuff. Now, some of his assumptions, I look at and I go like, okay, well, it's science fiction. I can make a different assumption about that. But it's the same general sort of problems there. So thinking that stuff through is kind of hard, and you need to sort of make sure that if you're going to have huge merchant fleets, there has to be something worth them carrying, and in a cost-effective way. And you don't always see that in science fiction.
Yeah.
So, let's see. And the last thing I've got on the list is the rotary container ship that we did. And I put in the Anglo-Dutch Wars there because the thing about that rotary container ship, that I realized early on, was that if you containerize your weapons, loading a weapon and loading a container full of mangoes from the outside looks pretty similar. And you could, with a little bit of forethought, all of your freighters are also warships in a way that we really haven't seen since the 1600s. So, Oh, which reminds me, I should mention that in Vada's War, there's a situation where there's basically there are some privateers that are fighting a war that's taking place out on the periphery, and they've basically up-armed civilian ships. But part of the problem is that there's an issue with up-arming ships like that, and that is the hulls are not really stressed for having these big weapons attached to them. And like one of the premier ships goes in for what they think is sort of routine maintenance, and they come back and they say, yeah, your ship's about to break in half. The nose of your ship is about to break off because you put a big ass gun there, and it's every time you fire that gun, it's cracking the structural frame, and you've got maybe 2 or 3 shots before the front of your starship just falls off. So it's an interesting ship from that regard. And not all military ships these days are built to the same standards. US Navy ships are famously actually pretty tough. Not all warships are built to what the US would consider to be naval standards. So,
yeah.
Logic's Finest says, that I made an interesting point. A method of travel that takes longer than 7 to 14 days isn't really viable, is it? It depends. Back in the days of the Age of Sail, you had some journeys that took a really long time. Like if you were a Venetian merchant and you were trying to get from Venice to the Spice Islands, that's probably a 6-month round trip. Especially back in the days when trade winds would sort of dictate which direction you sailed in. So it really comes down to what your life support is and what you're carrying, and how capital costs, how expensive your ship is. Like that's the thing about Star Trek ships is they're using antimatter. I would think even in Star Trek time period, antimatter has to be really, really expensive. It's hard to make. And it's not really a fuel in the same way that oil is a fuel. Oil is something that you pull out of the ground and you spend some energy refining it, but the amount of energy you get from burning it is dramatically higher than the amount of energy you spend to refine it. It's a net plus.
The best comparison I think we have would be a battery that has unlimited energy.
Yep. And antimatter is a battery. It's a way of storing energy that you've put into the form of antimatter.
It's just a futuristic sci-fi battery is and ultimately what it comes down to, but insert technobabble for why it works here.
Yeah. So Rob Davidoff gives a number from the Alliance Union universe. Almost 1,900 lives are registered to Dublin again. Wow, I didn't realize that ship was quite that big. The question is, were all those on board, or were some of those on other locations? But yeah, even if it's only most of those. So yeah, Logic's Finest also asked the question. In an emergency happens, how long would it take for support to reach, if you've got a life support question, problem, something else? Yeah. I mean, that's just the way it was.
Well, that's a point that they bring up in Firefly a couple of times.
Yeah.
Because there are several points where they mentioned, hey, our life support's not going to make it for us to get to here before we're even able to get fuel or a part to be able to fix it. So that is something that does occasionally come up.
Yeah.
It's just it's often glossed over in most, I would say, squeaky clean settings. So like Star Trek, for example, doesn't bring it up often.
No.
But something like Firefly, that's more on the Western, grungy, apocalyptic side of the setting, that is going to potentially bring it up more often than something like Star Trek. I think Battlestar Galactica even brings it up a couple of times. Like there are several series that do bring it up. It's just the lens by which the series is taking things tends to determine whether it comes up or not.
Yeah. You've got limitations on life support to get you from point A to point B. You've got limitations on fuel. But I mean, in a lot of places for most of human history, if you were out and you had a problem, you were just SOL.
Yeah.
Right? You know, it's not unusual for ships to just disappear. And you never knew
hell,
exactly what
Voyager
happened.
brings that up all the fucking time because they're out away from everyone. That's kind of the point of the series, that they are away from everyone and they don't have access to assistance when necessary, and they have to build those alliances along the way in order to have that safety net.
There was some episodes in the original series where, like, there was at least one where they picked up a distress signal that was 14 years old.
Yeah. No, like it does occasionally come up in Trek, but like unless it's something that specifically is like aimed at that sort of thing, it's gonna usually kind of gloss over it and be like, we don't talk about that.
Yeah.
Because like Riker's old it was Riker's old ship, right? They bring up that had been lost to time in TNG.
I don't remember.
I think it was Riker's ship.
Yes, where they end up with 2 Rikers.
Yeah,
No, it was either his or Picard's old ship, and they were doing like a war games situation.
It was Picard's old ship, the Stargazer.
Okay, so it was Picard's old ship. Or no, there was one that was like lost to time, and they found it because of the fucking it was the experimental phasing tech.
All right, I'm drawing a blank. Which reminds me, one of the things I want to do is just get to the point where I'm watching an episode of Star Trek every night. I figure when I get to the animated series, I'll watch 2 because they're short. There are, if you include the animated series, but you don't include. I'm sorry, what?
It's the Pegasus. They had lost it to time, and so like they finally had a distress signal for it like years later, and they sent the Enterprise out to go fucking find it.
I don't even remember that episode.
Yeah.
What was it? Was it a early episode?
That's a good question. Let me.
Because I think there's a couple of episodes.
He's very baby-faced in the picture that I'm seeing here, so maybe.
Yeah, it's possibly if it's one of the early episodes. There was a few from the first couple of seasons that I still might not have seen.
Let's see.
Well, Rob says it's season 7, so that wasn't early. I just don't remember this.
Okay.
I need to go back and rewatch. I need to go back.
I'm glad I'm not like over here like the only one who remembers this then. Yeah, the phasing cloak.
Okay. I need to go rewatch. So
yeah, he has to choose between his loyalty to Picard and his old captain, who's now an admiral.
Yeah, this is the one where that later got turned into the final episode of Star Trek Enterprise.
Yep, apparently.
And led Scott Bakula to yell at Rick Berman. which apparently was incredibly unusual because Scott Bakula was like a really, really easy guy to work with, and nothing fazed him, and he was just always Mr. Pleasant, and he like yelled at Rick Berman.
Yeah, no, when Scott Bakula goes off on someone, you know they have done something.
Yeah. Well, maybe more people should have yelled at Rick Berman. But
You're not wrong. You're not wrong.
So okay,
but Me Too hadn't happened yet, so
yeah. So okay, so the next question is, Peter, do we have anything left, or have we covered the waterfront?
I think we pretty much just references. I put some into the chat. Some of the books, and probably the big one I'll put in the chat is Sal's.
Yeah, he's got a there's also, if you do a search for his name, you can find there's a couple of interesting papers he's written too.
Yes.
He did a 2-part series for Strategic Sea Lift Week, and then it referenced something else that he had done for the Naval Institute that was really pretty good. Not on here, but part of that SimSec Strategic Sea Lift Week is there's one that's called the 4 Fs, and I forget what the 4 Fs were, but that one is very, very interesting if you're looking for inspiration for your science fiction universe, because it talks about putting containers with weapons on container ships and doing a bunch of sneaky stuff like that, to sort of leverage the merchants a little bit more. Now,
missiles and drones.
It's worth thinking all that stuff through, because that it's all well and good, why don't we just put weapons on them? Well, it's way more complicated than that, starting with the insurance. But it's definitely worth thinking about. Now, that having been said, there was one in the Strategic Sea Lift Week that I thought was an incredibly weak paper. It was the one that talked about how maybe we should just use container ships to move stuff, and people won't notice it if we use container ships to ship all of our military gear. To which point my response is, what size container do you put the M1 in? So yeah, you're right. You can put stuff in containers and ship it with containers, but as a general rule, the stuff that when you're talking about strategic sea lift, most of the stuff you're sending to begin with is not containerized cargo. It's things like an infantry division and all their gear. And that stuff does not go in containers.
It goes on railroads.
Yeah, you need a ro-ro for that sort of stuff. And so all this, and he talks something about, they could have decoys where they fake load some stuff onto a ro-ro, but instead they'll ship it via containers. It's like, no.
The other problem is they're just going to sink it all. They're just going to try and sink all of it. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what's on that ship. It's going to the right thing, carrying the wrong flag. Going to the right to this area, carrying this with this flag, or not flying that one. Make it go away.
So Logic Finance points out Rick Berman wasn't the showrunner in Enterprise. Okay, so I may be wrong about whose fault it was. So Roger that. I stand corrected. He also says, is there a shipping container big enough to hold an M1 tank? No. I think they're too wide and too tall, because M1s are huge. You've got 40-foot shipping containers, so they're okay in that dimension. They're also just, an M1's going to be too heavy for a shipping container.
They're too heavy for a standard ro-ro. Also, you have to beef up the ro-ros.
Yeah.
So
And a lot of the other, I mean, vehicles just don't fit in containers very well. They're only like 9 feet wide. And so a lot of those military vehicles, it's like, it's all well and good. You can drive inside, but then you can't get out of the car. You can't get out of the vehicle afterwards. So yeah, there's problems with that plan. So when Alam says something about C5s. Yeah, we see C5s. I'm not sure how many tanks have ever flown in a C5. We do know that they flew an M1 Abrams over. And from what I understand, we do it occasionally. For a while there, I thought that the total number of M1s that had ever been shipped by air was probably one, just so that they could film it coming off the M1 or off the C5 in Saudi Arabia before Desert Storm. I think I heard relatively recently that they've actually moved more than that, but they don't do it very often because it's a C5 can hold one. It's very, very heavy. So, okay. So I think, let's see, looking for a ship, I should point out, is old. It dates to 1990. And it describes a situation that is when there was a lot fewer jobs to go around. The merchant marine was bigger, lot more merchant mariners, a lot fewer jobs to go around. So a lot of what he has to say there is not applicable any longer, including the part about how you can get a freighter. You can travel via freighter for fairly cheap. From what I understand, that is not the case anymore. They basically charge you like you're in a hotel. So you're paying a nightly charge that's like a hotel room, not necessarily an expensive hotel room, but hey, it's $120 a day and your trip is going to take 17 days. Do the math. So, yeah, Logic's Finest also says something about infrastructure being built around current shipping containers. When we did the rotary container ship, we specifically decided that there was two different sizes of shipping containers. There was planetary shipping containers, which are approximately the size of a standard 40-foot 2 TEU, which is TEU stands for 20-foot equivalent unit, like a standard 40-foot container. But some number of those, and I think the answer was 27, would fit into an interstellar shipping container, which you would use for putting it into the container ship and getting it down to the planet afterwards and getting it back up afterwards. Interstellar shipping containers are something that become feasible because you've got ubiquitous countergrav. And so it's trivial to move big things like that around. But we decided that the planetary shipping containers were probably just easier to manipulate. And, the interstellar shipping containers are basically the size of a 3-story building. And so not everybody needs a 3-story building's worth of stuff. So, but I did an entire episode where I went through it and talked about it. So feel free to go and take a look at that episode. I may pull that one out, revamp it a little bit because I've done some more thinking and try to do it at some point in the future, redo that episode. But I'm not there yet. So, okay. Anything else? That's our last slide. Is there anything else that you have to say on this, Peter?
No, I don't think so. I mean, we can go on for another 3 hours if we went back through some of the stuff, but I think we're good. So,
yeah. So it's, and at some point I'm going to talk about logistics and we'll get into that again, but that'll be more about the importance of logistics and how it all changes. And, like John Hemery writing as Jack Campbell in his Lost Fleet series specifically solves the logistics problem by having a factory ship come along and, chew up some asteroids looking for, and, making whatever they need locally with their asteroid ship and stuff like that. So I'll talk about that at some point in the future. In the meantime, if I don't talk, probably will talk to you before you leave for the other side of the world. But if I don't, have a safe trip, and I look forward to seeing you when you get back.
Yep.
Have you, I know that you were like working your way through paperwork and getting a CAC and stuff like that. Has all that stuff happened yet?
I got classes starting Monday for Monday and Tuesday of next week.
Okay.
So,
Do you have a plane ticket yet?
no.
Okay. So you could be around for a while.
No, they're actually looking at a specific date, but
Oh,
it's close.
okay. Okay. All right. So you don't have a plane ticket, but you could have a plane ticket.
Yes.
Okay.
I think the difference is that they asked me if I could. They gave me a date on Friday, and they haven't been able to get in contact with travel to confirm it.
Okay. All right. Well, safe travels. And thank you very much for being on the show. It's always cool to come in and talk about Merchant Marine stuff. And if I'm doing the math right in my head, you'll be back in time for MarsCon, right?
No. I'm probably going to be back out just before MarsCon.
Just before.
Yeah, there's some other stuff going on schedule wise. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
So.
Well, we'll figure it all out.
Yep. Okay.
All right, then. Well, thank you very much, everybody. And as always, it's a pleasure spending my Saturday nights with you all. I really do appreciate that. I appreciate the fact that you guys have a good time, that you're willing to come and spend your Saturday night with me. So let's do it again next week. Bye.